Imagine walking through an American city in the 1880s, the streets lit by electric bulbs for the very first time, skyscrapers rising where brick buildings once stood, and fortunes being made almost overnight. But just a few blocks away, crowded tenements tell a different story. Families struggling, workers striking, reformers dreaming of change. Over the next few hours, I'll guide you through these contrasts, softly unfolding the stories that made the Gilded Age shine and crack all at once. Before we go further, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. And if you enjoy drifting off to history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Gilded surfaces, hard cores. When Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner coined the phrase "the Gilded Age" in their 1873 novel, they weren't just poking fun at the wealthy elites of their time. They were warning us about a society that had learned how to cover up cracks with a thin sheet of gold. Imagine a piece of furniture, an old wooden chair with splinters and dents, its legs slightly uneven. Now imagine painting it with a shimmering coat of gold leaf. To the casual eye, it looks luxurious, almost royal. But if you sit on it, the weakness reveals itself. That, in many ways, was America from the 1870s to the turn of the 20th century. On the surface, the United States looked like the most modern, energetic, and opportunity-filled nation in the world. Underneath, however, were splinters of inequality, corruption, and tension that threatened to snap the chair at any moment. The era opened in the aftermath of the Civil War, a conflict that had nearly torn the country apart. Reconstruction had tried to stitch the Union back together, but those stitches were fragile and uneven. In the North, industrial cities were buzzing with energy as steel mills roared and factories lit up the night sky. In the South, however, a different story was unfolding. The promise of freedom for millions of formerly enslaved people was quickly undermined by systems of segregation, violence, and disenfranchisement. It was as though the nation was building a glittering skyscraper on one side of the street while leaving the other side in shadow. Railroads became the most powerful symbol of this transformation. Like veins carrying lifeblood across a body, the tracks stretched from coast to coast, connecting farmers to markets, small towns to cities, and millions of Americans to goods they had never before imagined buying. Time itself had to be reshaped to fit the trains. Before railroads, each town kept its own local time, but trains needed precision. And so, standardized time zones were introduced, an invisible but radical transformation of daily life. The whistle of the locomotive wasn't just a sound, it was the pulse of a new America. But as with so much in this age, the benefits were uneven. Small farmers and local shippers often paid more for rail freight than the big industrialists who struck deals behind closed doors. The very veins that carried lifeblood could also bleed people dry. Immigration surged too. Picture a crowded dock at Castle Garden in New York, and later at Ellis Island. Families clutching suitcases, children wide-eyed as they gazed at the skyline of a city that seemed to scrape the heavens. Germans, Irish, Italians, Poles, Chinese, and many others stepped off ships with dreams of opportunity. For some, those dreams materialized: steady jobs, land to farm, children in schools. For many others, reality was far grimmer. They found themselves packed into tenement housing, working long hours in unsafe conditions, facing discrimination for their language, religion, or skin color. Yet even as they struggled, their labor built the very structures that defined the age: skyscrapers, railroads, factories, and neighborhoods that still stand today. To understand the duality of the Gilded Age, think of it like a grand dinner table. At the head sat the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Morgans, eating lavish meals of steak and caviar under the glow of electric chandeliers. Further down the table, workers and immigrants hunched over, their plates filled with scraps, their candles sputtering out. The table looked magnificent from the outside, silverware polished, wine glasses gleaming, but the experience was drastically different depending on where you sat. And yet, the story of the Gilded Age isn't just one of despair, it's also one of possibility. The inventions that flowed from this era, electric lights, telephones, elevators, were nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, people could communicate across miles in real time, could see a city's skyline transformed by towers of steel, could shop for goods from faraway places through catalogs delivered to their rural homes. If America was a laboratory, the Gilded Age was its period of wild experimentation. Some experiments succeeded spectacularly, others left scars. But beneath the hum of progress, conflicts brewed. Workers began to organize, not only to demand better wages, but also to insist on dignity. Farmers, squeezed by railroad monopolies and banking systems, started forming alliances. Women, confined by tradition, began stepping into public life through activism and reform. African Americans, even under the crushing weight of Jim Crow, built communities, schools, and movements that defied the promise-breaking of Reconstruction. The cracks in the golden surface weren't hidden from those who lived them. They were daily realities, cutting into skin and spirit. There were also debates about what kind of country America was becoming. Was it a nation where anyone could succeed through hard work? Or was it a place where wealth piled up in a few hands while millions labored in vain? Twain's metaphor of gilding wasn't just a clever literary flourish, it was a diagnosis of an identity crisis. On one hand, the US saw itself as the land of opportunity. On the other, it was a place where fortunes were built on exploitation, corruption, and inequality. Consider a what-if for a moment. What if the wealth of the era had been more evenly shared? What if the rise of the railroads had lifted every farmer, rather than bankrupting so many? What if immigrants had been welcomed with open arms instead of exclusion laws? Would the 20th century have been less turbulent, without the labor wars, the populist revolts, the protests for suffrage and civil rights? Or was the hardship necessary fuel for the reform movements that would eventually change the nation? These are questions without simple answers, but they remind us that history isn't just about what happened, it's also about what could have happened. The Gilded Age was like a theater production. The audience saw dazzling costumes, painted sets, and actors reciting lines of ambition and wealth. Backstage, however, workers hammered nails, mopped sweat, and struggled to keep the illusion alive. The play was impressive, but the backstage crew often paid the price. This tension between appearance and reality is the thread that runs through every story in this era, an age of triumphs and tragedies intertwined so tightly that it is hard to pull them apart. And so, as the curtain rises on this manuscript, we step into an America at once glittering and cracked, booming and broken. A country where every invention and every skyscraper carried a shadow, where every railroad spike drove both progress and conflict deeper into the soil. The surface sparkled, but the core told another story, one we will keep unraveling as we move further into the heart of the Gilded Age. Engines of industry: steel, oil, and coal. If the Gilded Age had a heartbeat, it was powered by the rumble of factories, the clang of steel, and the dark smoke that poured out of chimneys into the sky. America, still young by the world's standards, seemed to be running on endless energy. In the 1870s and 1880s, this energy came from three mighty engines: steel, coal, and oil. Together, they reshaped the landscape, transformed the economy, and redefined what daily life looked like for millions of Americans. Steel was the skeleton of the new nation. Before the Bessemer process and the open hearth furnace, steel had been expensive and difficult to produce in large quantities. Suddenly, with new methods, steel became abundant, affordable, and strong enough to build skyscrapers that pierced the skyline, bridges that stretched over vast rivers, and rails that tied together the continent. Cities like Pittsburgh became known as "hell with the lid off." because of the roaring furnaces, glowing fires, and polluted skies that blanketed the city. But in those fiery cauldrons, a new America was being forged. Steel was more than a metal. It was a symbol of permanence, ambition, and brute industrial strength. Coal provided the heat, the steam, and eventually the electricity that made this machinery run. Miners dug deep into the earth, often risking their lives for wages that barely sustained their families. Cave-ins, explosions, and lung disease were constant companions. Yet coal was indispensable. It fueled locomotives, powered factories, and heated homes. To imagine the Gilded Age without coal is like imagining today without electricity. Nearly every aspect of life depended on it. In the mining towns of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, whole communities lived and died by coal's rhythm, their lives bound to its dangerous promise. And then there was oil. At first, it was seen mostly as a curious fluid, useful for lamps and lubrication. But under the vision of men like John D. Rockefeller, oil became the blood of modern industry. Rockefeller's Standard Oil pioneered vertical integration, owning everything from wells to refineries to distribution networks, and horizontal integration, swallowing competitors until one company dominated nearly all refining in the nation. This wasn't just business, it was empire building, with pipelines and rail cars serving as the arteries of a corporate body that seemed as vast as the nation itself. Factories roared with constant activity. The workday was long, 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours, and the machines cared nothing for human fatigue. Injuries were common, and safety was an afterthought. Children worked alongside adults, their small fingers nimble enough for dangerous tasks. For many workers, it seemed that productivity mattered more than people, and human bodies were treated as expendable parts in the great industrial machine. Yet these sacrifices built the infrastructure that would carry America into the 20th century. To picture the scale, think of a modern metropolis lit up at night. In the Gilded Age, those lights were just beginning to glow, powered by coal-fired plants, wired with steel, and lubricated with oil. The very fabric of daily life, clothing, transportation, food, was stitched together by industrial might. A farmer in Kansas might wear boots with steel nails made in Pittsburgh, ride a train powered by coal from Pennsylvania, and light his home with a kerosene lamp refined in Cleveland. The chain of production, once local, had become national and soon global. But what if these industries had grown more slowly? What if steel had remained scarce, or oil had never been refined into kerosene and gasoline on such a massive scale? America's cities might have stayed low and sprawling instead of reaching upward into the sky. Railroads might have moved slower, delaying national markets. The United States might not have become the industrial powerhouse that it was by the dawn of the 20th century. History might have tilted toward a slower, more regional nation instead of one striding confidently onto the global stage. The engines of steel, coal, and oil did more than power machines. They shaped the culture of ambition and scale that defined the Gilded Age. The skyscraper wasn't just an office building, it was a declaration of modernity. The steel bridge wasn't just infrastructure, it was proof that nature's obstacles could be conquered. And the oil lamp flickering in a modest immigrant household wasn't just light. It was a sign that even the poorest could access a piece of industrial progress. The smoke that darkened the skies of Pittsburgh, the soot that coated the lungs of miners, and the slick oil that stained workers' hands were the true price of progress. Beneath the golden promise of industrial growth lay human cost. Yet Americans, dazzled by progress and new possibilities, pressed forward, building a future with materials pulled from the depths of the earth. These engines of industry didn't just transform cities and skylines, they transformed America itself. Rails that bound the continent. If steel, coal, and oil were the muscles of the Gilded Age, then the railroads were its nervous system. They pulsed across the land, carrying not only freight and passengers, but also ideas, news, and culture. Nothing defined the era more than the iron rails that stitched together an immense and varied country. Before the railroads, America felt like a patchwork quilt of regions, each with its own pace of life, its own rhythms of trade. After the railroads, the nation began to move as one body, its heartbeat set by the rhythm of locomotives. Imagine standing on a small-town platform in Nebraska in the 1880s. The horizon stretches endlessly, flat and quiet, until the whistle of a train cuts through the air. Suddenly the countryside shakes with steel wheels grinding over tracks, a black engine charging forward, pulling cars filled with goods from Chicago or passengers heading toward the Pacific coast. That moment captures the essence of what the railroad meant. It turned the isolated into the connected, the local into the national. The impact was practical, but also psychological. Time itself was remade. Before railroads, noon simply meant when the sun stood highest and every town set its own clocks. But trains required coordination. If Chicago's noon was 10 minutes different from St. Louis's noon, the entire system fell apart. So, in 1883, the nation adopted standardized time zones, an invisible revolution that touched every life, whether or not someone ever boarded a train. The world became measurable, predictable, and for many, more modern. Railroads accelerated trade and created national markets. A farmer in Iowa could ship corn to New York, a cattle rancher in Texas could send beef to Chicago, and California's orchards could sweeten breakfast tables in Boston. Goods no longer had to rely solely on rivers or local markets. What once took weeks by wagon could be done in days by rail. The economic map was redrawn with iron lines. Cities that became major hubs, Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, exploded in size and influence, while towns bypassed by the tracks withered, sometimes fading into ghost towns. The railroad's logic was ruthless. Prosperity followed the rails, and poverty often clung to the places they left behind. But this system was not fair or neutral. Behind the gleam of progress lay battles over who benefited. Large shippers, the big corporations, often received secret rebates, paying less to transport their goods than smaller competitors. Farmers, especially in the Midwest, discovered that the same network that gave them access to new markets could also strangle them with high rates. Rate wars erupted between competing lines, with prices plummeting one month only to surge the next. It was a game of power, and small shippers often felt like pawns. The federal government, for much of the Gilded Age, hesitated to intervene. Railroads were private companies, but they performed a public function, moving the nation's lifeblood of goods and people. The tension between private profit and public good became glaring. By the late 1880s, outrage from farmers and small businesses forced Washington to act. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 became the first attempt at national regulation, creating a commission to oversee rates and practices. It was a modest step, weakly enforced, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, the federal government acknowledged that it had to face the power of industrial giants. And yet, the railroad story is not just about economics or politics. It is about culture and imagination. The railroads shrank the country, making distant places seem suddenly close. They allowed families separated by thousands of miles to reunite. They carried immigrants westward to settle prairies and deserts. They brought Eastern tourists to gaze at Yellowstone or Yosemite, sparking the beginnings of a conservation ethic. They carried newspapers, catalogs, and letters, weaving together a national conversation. Still, the changes were not without costs. The rails carved across Native American lands, often disregarding treaties and destroying buffalo herds that tribes depended on. The dream of connection for settlers was often a nightmare of dispossession for indigenous people. The railroad embodied the paradox of the Gilded Age. It promised opportunity, but that promise was uneven, built on the losses of others. Consider a what if. What if the railroads had developed more slowly? without massive land grants and subsidies? Would the nation have remained more regional, its cities and cultures less tightly bound? Would the South have stayed more isolated, the West more wild, the Midwest more agricultural? Or did the rapid rush of the railroads create the very energy that propelled the US into modernity? These questions linger, like the echo of a departing train fading into the horizon. The railroad era was an age of paradox, efficiency and exploitation, progress and injustice, expansion and loss. The tracks bound the continent together, but they also bound the nation to new forms of dependence, on schedules, on corporations, on an interconnected market that could bring prosperity or ruin. The sound of the locomotive was the sound of America learning to move as one, for better or worse. Robber barons or captains of industry? Few figures from the Gilded Age loom as large as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. Their names are etched into American history, synonymous with wealth on a scale that seemed almost mythical. For many, they embodied efficiency, vision, and the unstoppable force of progress. For others, they represented greed, monopoly, and the corruption of politics by money. To this day, the debate lingers. Were they robber barons, exploiting the nation for personal gain, or captains of industry, steering America toward a brighter, more powerful future? Rockefeller, with his Standard Oil empire, was the master of control. He perfected both vertical integration, owning wells, refineries, pipelines, and distribution, and horizontal integration, eliminating competitors through buyouts and alliances, until his company controlled nearly all oil refining in the United States. To his admirers, he was a genius of organization, able to reduce waste, cut costs, and deliver cheap oil to millions of households. To his critics, he was a monopolist who crushed small businesses and corrupted politics with his immense influence. Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, built an empire out of molten metal. A Scottish immigrant who rose from poverty, Carnegie personified the dream of self-made success. His steel mills supplied the bones of modern America: bridges, railroads, skyscrapers. Yet the conditions in his factories were brutal. Long hours, dangerous machinery, low wages. The infamous Homestead Strike of 1892 revealed the dark side of his empire, when workers clashed with private guards in a bloody conflict. Later in life, Carnegie turned toward philanthropy, giving away much of his fortune to libraries, universities, and cultural institutions. His gospel of wealth argued that the rich had a moral duty to redistribute their wealth for the betterment of society. But critics wondered, was philanthropy a noble act, or a way to polish a reputation built on exploitation? J.P. Morgan, the great financier, did not build steel or pump oil. He moved money. His banking empire funded railroads, reorganized struggling industries, and even stabilized the US economy during financial panics. Morgan had the power to summon titans of industry to his office and dictate terms that shaped entire sectors of the economy. Admirers called him a stabilizer, a man who brought order to chaos. Detractors accused him of wielding too much private power over public interests, blurring the line between capitalism and oligarchy. These men employed strategies that were new to the American economy: trusts, cartels, and mergers that concentrated power in ways the law had never encountered before. Their dominance sparked some of the earliest antitrust debates, leading to legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Yet even when laws were passed, enforcement lagged behind. The giants of industry often moved faster than the lawmakers who sought to contain them. Philanthropy added another layer to their legacy. Carnegie's libraries brought knowledge to small towns across America. Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago and funded medical research that saved countless lives. Morgan's art collections enriched museums. These gifts softened criticism and created institutions that still stand today. But the question remains, can generosity erase the harm caused in the pursuit of profit? Or is it, as some argued then and still argue now, simply a golden mask covering the scars of industrial capitalism. What if these men had chosen different paths? What if Rockefeller had faced stronger competition? Or if Carnegie had prioritized worker welfare over maximum efficiency? Would America's industrial rise have been slower, perhaps less spectacular, but also less brutal? Or was the very harshness of their methods what propelled the nation into modernity? The answers are not simple. They remind us that progress often comes entwined with contradiction, that wealth and power can create and destroy in equal measure. The legacies of Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan remain carved into the steel and stone of American life. Their fortunes helped build universities and museums, but their practices also built the case for government regulation of business. Whether we see them as robber barons or captains of industry may depend less on them than on how we define progress itself. The new face of cities, from brick to steel and glass. Cities in the Gilded Age were not merely growing. They were transforming into something altogether new, something the world had rarely seen before. For centuries, cities had been built of brick, wood, and stone, their skylines defined by church steeples and domes. But by the 1880s and 1890s, America began to write a new language of architecture, one spelled out in steel beams and glass panes, powered by elevators and lit by electricity. The American city was reinventing itself, and in doing so, it reinvented the way people lived, worked, and imagined the future. Take New York, Chicago, and later cities like St. Louis or San Francisco. They became laboratories of modernity. The Chicago School of Architecture, led by innovators like Louis Sullivan, pioneered the steel frame construction that allowed buildings to rise higher than ever before. Without the steel skeleton and the invention of the safety elevator, skyscrapers would have been impossible. Suddenly, the skyline itself became a marker of ambition. Each new tower was not just a building, but a statement that here, in America, the future was vertical. But while the skyline soared, the ground level told a different story. Tenement housing, crowded, poorly ventilated, often lacking plumbing, became the home of millions of working-class families, many of them immigrants. The Lower East Side of New York was a maze of narrow streets and dark stairwells, where families might share a single room, where disease spread quickly, and where children played in alleys filled with garbage. Journalists and reformers like Jacob Riis brought these realities to public attention in works like How the Other Half Lives, shocking middle-class Americans with photographs of squalor. It was a reminder that progress could cast long shadows. Cities became places of both wonder and danger. Electric lighting stretched the day into the night, giving birth to nightlife, entertainment districts, and a sense of possibility that life could be lived around the clock. Streetcars and elevated trains expanded the physical reach of the city, allowing people to live further from their workplaces and creating the first true suburbs. Yet these developments also widened social divides. The wealthy moved uptown or into new suburban enclaves, enjoying spacious homes away from the noise, while the poor remained packed into inner-city tenements. Geography itself became a reflection of class. Urban planning and infrastructure projects reshaped daily rhythms. Sewage systems improved sanitation, although not fast enough to prevent epidemics in growing neighborhoods. Wide boulevards, inspired by Paris, gave certain districts a sense of grandeur, while backstreets remained choked with congestion. The contrast between the elegant avenues and the overcrowded alleys was stark, a visible representation of inequality written onto the map itself. Real estate speculation drove much of this transformation. Developers sought to capitalize on new technologies and the influx of workers, often prioritizing profit over livability. Whole neighborhoods could rise overnight, sometimes planned, sometimes chaotic. The constant churn of construction filled the air with dust and noise, but it also fed a sense that the city was alive, restless, always becoming something new. If we imagine the city as a body, the skyscrapers were its skeleton, the streetcars its arteries, and the tenements its cramped lungs. The lifeblood of workers, immigrants, entrepreneurs, and visionaries flowed through these systems, keeping the body alive but also straining it. The city was resilient but fragile, modern yet perilously unbalanced. And yet, the city was magnetic. Rural Americans flocked to it, drawn by jobs, excitement, and the sense of being part of something bigger than themselves. Immigrants arriving from distant ports found themselves overwhelmed by the noise, the lights, the density. For them, the city was both promise and peril, a place where opportunity shimmered just beyond the reach of hardship. What if the skyscraper had never been invented? Would cities have remained sprawling, low to the ground, less dense and less dynamic? Would suburbs have formed in the same way without streetcars and trains extending their reach? The American city might have looked more like its European counterparts, grand, yes, but horizontal. Instead, the US pioneered vertical living, creating an environment that shaped modern urban life worldwide. In the Gilded Age city, contrasts were everywhere. Light and shadow, wealth and poverty, innovation and squalor. It was a place where one could look up at glittering towers and down at filthy gutters, often on the same street corner. The city became a mirror of America itself, ambitious, restless, and divided. The tide of immigration. The Gilded Age was not just about steel and skyscrapers, it was also about people, millions of them, arriving from distant shores with hopes folded into their luggage. From the 1870s to the early 20th century, America experienced one of the greatest migrations in human history. Ships carried families from Ireland and Germany, and later waves of Italians, Poles, Russians, Jews, and countless others from southern and eastern Europe. Across the Pacific came Chinese and Japanese laborers, stepping into a land that promised opportunity, but often delivered hostility. Together, they formed a tide of humanity that reshaped the face of American cities. Imagine standing on the docks of New York Harbor, watching a ship unload. The air is thick with the smell of salt and coal smoke. Children cling to their mothers. Men carry worn bundles of clothes. Women clutch prayer books or letters from relatives already settled. For them, the Statue of Liberty was more than a monument. It was a signpost that they had arrived in a place where dreams might be possible. Yet, as they passed through Castle Garden and later Ellis Island, they faced questions, medical inspections, and the anxiety of not knowing if they would be admitted or turned away. Once in the city, immigrants often clustered in ethnic neighborhoods where language, religion, and custom provided familiarity in an unfamiliar land. New York's Little Italy, Chicago's Polish neighborhoods, San Francisco's Chinatown, all became cultural enclaves that helped newcomers survive. Churches and synagogues offered spiritual refuge, while ethnic newspapers connected readers to both old homelands and new realities. Mutual aid societies sprang up, offering insurance, loans, and support networks at a time when government assistance was minimal. These communities were lifelines, softening the sharp edges of urban life. Yet these enclaves also created tensions. While some Americans celebrated the diversity as part of a melting pot, others worried that immigrants were refusing to assimilate. Critics claimed that foreign languages and customs threatened American identity. The idea of the melting pot was more myth than reality in this period. Cultures often remained parallel, coexisting but not blending, and sometimes clashing. In tenement houses, Irish families might live next door to Italians or Jews, each with their own traditions, each struggling for the same scarce jobs. The labor market eagerly consumed immigrant workers, but at a steep human price. Men were hired to dig canals, lay railroad tracks, and work in mines and factories. Women found employment in textile mills, laundries, or as domestic servants. Wages were low, hours were long, and conditions were often unsafe. Employers valued immigrants precisely because they would accept difficult work for little pay, and because the constant flow of newcomers meant a workforce that could be easily replaced. For the working poor, life was a cycle of labor, exhaustion, and survival. Hostility toward immigrants grew alongside their numbers. Nativist groups portrayed them as a threat to American values, accusing them of stealing jobs, spreading disease, or being prone to crime. Anti-Catholic sentiment targeted Irish and Italian immigrants, while Eastern European Jews faced suspicion and discrimination. But no group faced harsher treatment than Asians. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred Chinese laborers from entering the country, the first federal law to exclude an entire nationality. Later restrictions extended to other Asian groups. Chinatowns became both sanctuaries and targets of violence, as in the Rock Springs Massacre of 1885 in Wyoming, where dozens of Chinese miners were killed. Despite the prejudice, immigrants contributed enormously to the fabric of American life. They built railroads, staffed factories, opened shops, and brought cultural traditions that enriched the nation. Cuisine, music, religious practices, all became part of the evolving American identity. The irony of the era was that immigrants were both essential to economic growth and scapegoated for social problems. What if immigration had been halted altogether? Would America have industrialized as quickly without the labor of millions of newcomers? Would cities like New York or Chicago have become global giants without the culture, energy, and manpower provided by immigrant communities? Perhaps the skyscrapers would still have risen, but who would have built them? The immigrant story is inseparable from the rise of the modern United States. The tide of immigration during the Gilded Age was both a promise and a test. It revealed the nation's capacity for diversity, but also its limits of tolerance. The crowded streets, the clashing cultures, the opportunities and the exclusions, all of it shaped an urban society that was vibrant yet hierarchical, rich in variety yet burdened by inequality. The city became a map of coexistence, parallel cultures side by side, each leaving an indelible mark on the American story. Labor's new map, from craft to mass production. The Gilded Age was a time when work itself was transformed. For centuries, labor had been defined by artisanal trades, blacksmiths, cobblers, carpenters, tailors, craftsmen who took pride in the mastery of their skill, controlling the pace of their labor and often owning their tools. But the new industrial order shifted that balance of power dramatically. Factories rose like cathedrals of steel and smoke, swallowing trades into assembly lines where workers no longer built entire products but repeated a single task over and over. What once felt like craft became routine, and the worker's identity began to change with it. The tyranny of the clock became a central fact of industrial life. In artisanal workshops, time had been flexible, defined by the completion of a job or the rising and setting of the sun. In factories, the whistle dictated everything. A shrill blast announced the start of the shift, another the lunch break, another the end of the day. Minutes mattered, and lateness could mean dismissal. Workers were no longer masters of their own rhythm. They moved to the beat of machines. Time studies by managers measured each motion, reducing human effort to numbers on a chart. It was efficiency for the owners, but dehumanization for those on the shop floor. To cope with this loss of autonomy, workers turned to organization. The Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, tried to create a broad tent for all who toiled, whether skilled or unskilled, men or women, native-born or immigrant. Their vision was inclusive, almost utopian. They sought not only better wages, but also the dignity of labor as a whole. The American Federation of Labor, AFL, led by Samuel Gompers, took a different approach, focusing on skilled trades and specific workplace improvements. Where the Knights dreamed of universal solidarity, the AFL sought pragmatic gains, shorter hours, higher pay, safer conditions for those who had leverage through their specialized skills. The battleground was the factory floor. Piecework systems paid workers by output rather than time, pushing them to exhaustion in pursuit of wages that rarely matched the effort. Yellow dog contracts forced workers to sign agreements never to join a union, while strikebreakers, often newly arrived immigrants desperate for work, were hired to replace those who walked out. Employers maintained blacklists to ensure known union organizers could not find work elsewhere. And when disputes grew violent, private security forces like the Pinkertons were brought in, armed and ready to suppress strikes. The balance of power tilted heavily toward the owners, backed by courts and often by government troops. Yet unions were more than economic tools. They became vehicles for dignity and solidarity. Meetings, songs, banners, and strikes created a sense of identity, reminding workers that they were not alone. To join a union was to declare that labor mattered, that workers were not disposable cogs in the industrial machine. Even in defeat, unions planted seeds of resistance, building traditions that would eventually bear fruit in the progressive era and beyond. Life for the average factory worker was harsh. Imagine a textile mill in Massachusetts, filled with the roar of looms so loud that workers had to shout to be heard. Dust choked the air, hours stretched into the evening, and children as young as 10 tended the machines. Their small hands could reach where adults could not, but accidents were frequent. Fingers lost to the relentless gears. This was the cost of mass production, a system that prioritized output above all else. But what if the factory system had evolved differently? What if employers had embraced shorter hours and safer conditions from the start? Could America have become an industrial giant without the suffering that scarred so many lives? Or was the hardship itself the engine of progress, forcing society to confront the need for reform? The what-ifs linger, like the echo of a factory whistle fading into the night. The new map of labor was written in sweat, conflict, and negotiation. It redrew the relationship between worker and owner, shifting the balance of autonomy, creating organizations to defend dignity, and introducing battles that would shape the American workplace for generations. From artisanal pride to mass production discipline, the journey of labor in the Gilded Age was one of both loss and resilience. Strikes that shook the nation. The Gilded Age was an era of extraordinary growth, but that growth came with friction. Friction between capital and labor, between owners and workers, between the promise of opportunity and the reality of exploitation. Nowhere did that friction spark more violently than in the great strikes that swept the nation. From the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 to the Pullman Strike of 1894, each eruption of labor unrest was more than a local dispute. It was a national drama that forced Americans to ask, whose side was the government on? The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was the opening act. When the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced yet another wage cut, workers walked off the job. What began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, spread like wildfire along the rail lines. Trains stopped, freight piled up, crowds swelled, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. In Pittsburgh, rioters set fire to rail yards, destroying engines and cars in a blaze that lit up the night sky. State militias were called in, and in several cities, troops fired into crowds. By the time it was over, more than 100 people were dead. The strike revealed both the power of rail workers to disrupt the nation's arteries and the willingness of authorities to use armed force to defend property. Less than a decade later, in 1886, Chicago became the stage for the Haymarket Affair. What began as a peaceful rally for the 8-hour workday turned into chaos. As police moved in to disperse the crowd, a bomb exploded. Panic ensued, shots rang out, and when the smoke cleared, both officers and civilians lay dead or wounded. The incident shocked the nation. Newspapers branded labor activists as dangerous radicals, even terrorists. 8 anarchists were arrested, 4 hanged, despite thin evidence. Haymarket cast a long shadow, tainting the labor movement with suspicion and fear. For some Americans, the idea of workers demanding rights became entangled with visions of anarchy and violence. Then came Homestead in 1892, a battle that played out on the banks of the Monongahela River in Pennsylvania. The Carnegie Steel Company, under Henry Clay Frick, locked out workers after a contract dispute with the powerful Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. The company hired Pinkerton Guards, armed private security, to break the strike. When the Pinkertons tried to land by barge, workers and townspeople confronted them. Gunfire erupted in a brutal clash that left dead on both sides. The state militia eventually occupied the town, and the Union was crushed. For Carnegie, the steel empire rolled on. For workers, it was a bitter defeat that underscored how little power they had when capital was backed by both private armies and the state. The Pullman Strike of 1894 extended the conflict to a national scale. Pullman, Illinois, was a company town built by the Pullman Palace Car Company, where workers lived in neat houses, but paid rent deducted from their wages. When wages were cut but rent stayed the same, resentment boiled over. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene Five Debs, called a boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. The boycott spread across the country, paralyzing rail traffic. Mail delivery was disrupted, a federal offense, and President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops. Violence erupted, rail cars were burned, and clashes left dozens dead. Debs was arrested, the strike broken. But the event sparked a broader debate. Was the federal government the guardian of the people, or merely the enforcer of corporate power? Each of these strikes tested the role of the state. Time and again, when labor clashed with capital, authorities stepped in, not to mediate, but to protect property, restore order, and punish strikers. Courts issued injunctions against unions, treating strikes as conspiracies. The press, often owned by wealthy elites, portrayed workers as mobs threatening civilization itself. Yet, for every setback, the strikes also spread awareness. They turned the labor question into a national conversation. Imagine a factory whistle falling silent, a train left motionless on its tracks, a city street filled with workers demanding justice. The silence and the noise were equally powerful, the silence of halted production, the noise of voices rising in defiance. These strikes were reminders that progress had a human cost, and that beneath the glitter of prosperity lay a simmering conflict. What if the government had chosen differently? What if, instead of siding with corporations, it had protected workers' right to strike, recognized their unions, and pressured employers to compromise? Perhaps America's path to labor reform would have been less violent, less bloody. Instead, the nation stumbled forward, each strike a scar, each defeat a lesson, each confrontation a preview of struggles to come. The strikes of the Gilded Age were not isolated tempests, they were storms that swept across the nation. They revealed the raw tension between capital and labor, the fragility of order when millions lived on the edge of poverty, and the central role of government in shaping outcomes. Violence was never far when production halted, and in those moments the promise of the American dream seemed both closer and more fragile than ever. Machine politics and reform. If the factories and railroads were the engines of the Gilded Age, then political machines were its gears, sometimes grinding smoothly, sometimes seizing up, but always in motion. In the crowded cities of the late 19th century, politics was not just about speeches in Congress or debates in state houses. It was woven into the daily lives of immigrants, laborers, and small shopkeepers. Nowhere was this more visible than in New York City, where Tammany Hall, the most famous of all political machines, became both a symbol of corruption and a lifeline for the poor. Tammany Hall operated less like a formal political party and more like a neighborhood syndicate. Imagine an immigrant family arriving in New York, bewildered by the noise, unable to speak English, unsure of where to find work or housing. A ward boss, a local political operative, would show up, offering help, a job for the father, coal for the winter, or legal assistance for a landlord dispute. In exchange, when election day came, that family was expected to vote the right way. The transaction was simple: favors for loyalty. Multiply this by thousands, and you had a machine capable of delivering whole blocks of votes. But the machines were not merely neighborhood charities. They fed on patronage, handing out city contracts and government jobs to loyal supporters. Public works projects often meant inflated bills, kickbacks, and waste. Streets might get paved, but at double the cost. A courthouse might rise, but with funds siphoned into the pockets of insiders. The notorious Tweed Ring, led by boss William M. Tweed of Tammany Hall, epitomized this corruption in the 1860s and 1870s, stealing an estimated tens of millions of dollars from New York City. Yet even Tweed defended himself by claiming that he had provided services the city otherwise would not have had. In a sense, the machine was both parasite and provider. This paradox made political machines difficult to dismantle. They offered real benefits, jobs, protection, community support to people often ignored by elites. At the same time, they entrenched inequality, stifled reform, and made public office a commodity. For immigrants and the poor, a boss might be the only person who listened. For reformers, the bosses were obstacles to democracy, symbols of a system that valued loyalty over competence. Opposition to machine politics came from a variety of corners. The so-called mugwumps, independent-minded reformers, often upper-class professionals, criticized machines as corrupt and inefficient. They pushed for civil service reform, arguing that government jobs should be awarded on merit, not political loyalty. Their efforts bore fruit with the Pendleton Act of 1883, which established a merit-based system for certain federal positions. It was a modest start, covering only a fraction of government jobs, but it signaled a shift toward professional bureaucracy. The contrast between bosses and reformers was not always clean-cut. Some bosses were charismatic figures who shaped their neighborhoods with genuine care. They organized parades, funded local churches, and helped widows or orphans. Reformers, meanwhile, sometimes appeared aloof, preaching ideals but failing to understand the gritty realities of city life. The struggle between machines and reformers was as much cultural as political. A clash between pragmatic, if corrupt, problem solvers and idealists determined to build a cleaner system. What if political machines had never existed? Would immigrants have found another safety net? Or would they have been left adrift in hostile cities? Would infrastructure have been built faster or slower without the incentive of patronage contracts? Perhaps reform would have come sooner, or perhaps chaos would have reigned in the absence of organizational structures. The machine was, in many ways, an imperfect response to rapid urbanization, a rough, flawed bridge between tradition and modern governance. By the end of the century, the seeds of reform were beginning to sprout. Civil service examinations expanded, journalists exposed corruption, and middle-class voters demanded efficiency. Yet machines did not disappear overnight. They lingered, adapting, sometimes weakening, sometimes resurging. In their rise and decline, they left a lasting imprint, a reminder that democracy is not only about ideals written in law, but also about the messy, transactional realities of human need. Law, regulation, and the monopoly dilemma. By the late 19th century, private corporations had grown into entities so massive that they seemed to rival governments themselves. Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, and sprawling railroad networks wielded more money, influence, and manpower than many states. Their leaders could dictate prices, set wages, and even sway elections. This imbalance raised an unsettling question. If corporations had become stronger than the laws designed to contain them, who truly ruled America? The people, through their elected representatives, or the magnates of industry through sheer economic power? The answer, at first, tilted toward the corporations. Legal traditions had been written in an earlier era, one where companies were small and local. The rise of nationwide trusts forced lawmakers to improvise. Farmers, small merchants, and laborers increasingly demanded that government step in, arguing that unchecked monopolies strangled opportunity. And so came the first efforts at federal regulation. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was born from outrage at railroad practices. Farmers complained bitterly of discriminatory rates. Large shippers received secret rebates, while small shippers were charged inflated prices. The act created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first federal regulatory body in American history. On paper, it was meant to ensure reasonable and just rates. In practice, it was hamstrung. Railroads wielded armies of lawyers, court rulings often sided with business, and the ICC had limited power to enforce its decisions. Still, its creation marked a recognition that the national economy required national oversight. Just 3 years later came the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Its language was sweeping. Any contract combination or conspiracy in restraint of trade was declared illegal. The act targeted the massive trusts that dominated industries from oil to sugar to steel. It was hailed as a victory for fair competition, a signal that the government was finally ready to rein in the giants. Yet the reality was more complicated. Courts interpreted the act narrowly, often ruling that it applied only to unreasonable restraints, leaving corporations broad leeway. In fact, early enforcement sometimes turned the law against labor unions, treating strikes and boycotts as conspiracies restraining trade. The law intended to check monopolies was used to weaken the very workers who had pushed for reform. The dilemma was not just legal but philosophical. What exactly was fair competition? To the magnates, efficiency and scale justified dominance. Why should Rockefeller's Standard Oil be punished for lowering prices and driving out inefficient rivals? Wasn't that progress? To critics, however, such dominance suffocated innovation and left consumers with fewer choices once competition was eliminated. Economists, lawyers, and lobbyists clashed over definitions. Was monopoly a disease or simply the natural outcome of capitalism? In the courts, corporations often argued that they had the same rights as individuals under the Constitution. Through interpretations of the 14th Amendment, originally intended to protect the rights of freed slaves, judges extended protections to corporations, shielding them from certain regulations. It was a striking irony. Laws designed to protect the vulnerable were invoked to defend the powerful. Meanwhile, the public grew restless. Cartoons in newspapers depicted corporations as giant octopuses, their tentacles wrapped around Congress, the courts, and the people. Debates spilled into everyday conversations, from farmers' granges in the Midwest to union halls in industrial cities. The monopoly question was no longer abstract. It was a lived reality. Prices, wages, and opportunities were all shaped by the immense power of trusts. What if enforcement had been stronger from the start? What if the Sherman Act had been wielded decisively against Standard Oil in the 1890s instead of waiting until the early 20th century? Would smaller businesses have thrived, making the economy more diverse and resilient? Or would weaker companies have simply slowed America's rapid industrial growth? The answers remain speculative, but they highlight the delicate balance between freedom and fairness in the marketplace. The monopoly dilemma of the Gilded Age planted seeds of debates that endure today. How much power should corporations hold? When does efficiency become exploitation? Where should the line between private wealth and public interest be drawn? The laws of the late 19th century were imperfect tools, often blunted by courts and captured by lobbyists, but they represented the first attempts to write rules for an economy that had outgrown its old boundaries. Money, gold, and panics. The glitter of the Gilded Age was more fragile than it appeared. Beneath the skyscrapers and the smokestacks, the American financial system was dangerously unstable. Banks rose and fell with dizzying speed, credit flowed and dried up like a fickle river, and the value of money itself became the subject of heated national debate. Twice, in 1873 and 1893, the bubble burst spectacularly, plunging the nation into deep economic crises. These panics were not just numbers on balance sheets, they were breadlines, foreclosures, bankruptcies, and ruined lives. They also turned monetary policy into one of the fiercest battlegrounds in American politics. The Panic of 1873 erupted when the banking house of J. Cook and Company collapsed. Cook had gambled heavily on railroad bonds, betting that the expansion of tracks across the continent would never slow. But when construction outpaced demand, the bubble burst. Banks shuttered, businesses folded, and unemployment surged. In New York, thousands crowded outside closed banks, begging for deposits they would never see again. The country slid into what was then called the Great Depression, a 6-year downturn that scarred an entire generation. 2 decades later, the Panic of 1893 struck with equal ferocity. Triggered by railroad failures and shaky investments, it spiraled into a banking crisis and mass unemployment. Factories shut their doors, farms went under, and millions were thrown out of work. In Chicago alone, more than a quarter of the workforce lost jobs. Coxey's army, a march of desperate unemployed men, trudged to Washington, demanding government action. They were dismissed as radicals, but their march symbolized the human toll of abstract financial collapse. At the heart of these crises lay a question that cut to the core of the economy. What kind of money should America use? The nation was on the gold standard, meaning that every dollar was backed by a fixed amount of gold. For creditors, bankers, and international investors, this promised stability and confidence. But for debtors, especially farmers in the Midwest and South, it was a straitjacket. With limited gold reserves, the money supply could not expand fast enough to keep up with growth. That meant deflation. Prices for crops fell, debts grew heavier, and farmers felt crushed by forces beyond their control. Enter the cry for free silver. Advocates wanted silver, mined abundantly in the American West, to be coined freely alongside gold. Expanding the money supply, they argued, would raise prices, ease debts, and put more currency into circulation. For farmers drowning in loans, it was salvation. For bankers in New York, it was recklessness, a path to inflation, instability, and ruined credit. The debate was not simply about metal, it was about power. Gold represented the city, the creditor, the established order. Silver represented the countryside, the debtor, the struggling majority. The issue exploded into politics, fueling fiery speeches and passionate campaigns. In 1896, Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan electrified the nation with his Cross of Gold speech, declaring that mankind should not be crucified on a cross of gold. He championed free silver as the cause of the common man against the moneyed elites. His opponent, Republican William McKinley, stood firmly for the gold standard, reassuring business interests and international investors. The election became a referendum on money itself, and McKinley's victory sealed the dominance of gold for a time. But the panics left scars. They exposed how fragile the financial system was, how dependent it was on speculation and confidence. They revealed that the government had few tools to stabilize the economy. No central bank, no deposit insurance, no systematic relief for the unemployed. The panics were both financial and social crises, shaking faith in the system and fueling demands for reform. What if America had embraced silver more fully? Would farmers have been rescued from crushing debts, or would runaway inflation have wrecked the economy? What if the government had intervened more directly to stabilize banks and aid the unemployed? Might the Great Depression of the 1930s have been less severe if reforms had come earlier? The what-ifs remind us that economic policy is never abstract. It is lived in homes lost, jobs gone, and lives upended. Money in the Gilded Age was more than coins and notes. It was a battleground of values. Was the economy meant to protect the strong or support the weak? Should stability or opportunity be the priority? The panics of 1873 and 1893 did not answer these questions, but they ensured that money, gold, silver, or otherwise, would remain at the heart of American politics for decades to come. The South's Counterrevolution. The Gilded Age was a story of progress for some, but in the American South it was also a story of retreat. After the brief, turbulent experiment of Reconstruction, white elites orchestrated what can only be called a counter-revolution. Through laws, intimidation, and violence, they clawed back the political and social control they had lost after the Civil War. For African Americans, who had glimpsed freedom and opportunity in the 1860s and 1870s, the closing decades of the 19th century brought disenfranchisement, segregation, and terror. The South wrapped itself in the language of order and tradition, but beneath those words was a system built on exclusion and fear. The ballot box was the first target. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and complex registration systems created barriers that disproportionately affected black voters and poor whites alike. Grandfather clauses, exempting men from these requirements if their ancestors had voted before the Civil War, ensured that white men retained their political voice, while black men were silenced. By the 1890s, black political participation, once vibrant during Reconstruction, had been reduced to a whisper. Entire communities lost their right to shape their future. The legal scaffolding of segregation followed. Jim Crow laws spread across the South, mandating separate but equal facilities in schools, trains, and public spaces. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, stamped this system with constitutional legitimacy. In theory, separation promised equality. In practice, it meant underfunded schools, inferior services, and the codification of second-class citizenship. Segregation was not just a set of laws, it was a daily humiliation, a constant reminder of who belonged and who did not. Violence was the ever-present enforcer of this order. Lynchings terrorized African American communities, with mobs carrying out public murders that were sometimes advertised in advance and attended by crowds. These acts of brutality were designed not only to punish individuals, but to intimidate entire populations. The message was clear. To resist white supremacy was to risk one's life. Another form of exploitation came through convict leasing. States leased prisoners, disproportionately black men, out to private companies for labor in mines, railroads, and plantations. Conditions were brutal, often worse than slavery had been, since companies had little incentive to preserve prisoners' lives. The system blurred the line between punishment and profit, turning black bodies into a commodity once again. Yet even under these crushing conditions, resistance never disappeared. African Americans built institutions that nurtured hope and dignity. Churches became centers of community life, offering not just spiritual solace but also meeting spaces for organizing. Black newspapers gave voice to grievances, reported injustices, and fostered debate. Schools, often underfunded and attacked, became beacons of possibility. Teachers and students alike understood that education was both a shield and a weapon. Leaders like Ida B. Wells risked everything to expose lynching, while Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois debated strategies for uplift, one emphasizing vocational education and accommodation, the other demanding full civil rights and higher learning. The South's counter-revolution was not inevitable. It was a choice, backed by laws, courts, and violence. What if Reconstruction had been sustained longer, with stronger federal enforcement of rights? Could the South have developed into a more inclusive democracy earlier, sparing generations the weight of Jim Crow? Or was the nation too unwilling to challenge white supremacy when other parts of the country were focused on railroads, industry, and empire? These what-ifs linger, painful reminders of paths not taken. The story of the South in the Gilded Age is thus one of stark contrasts. The tightening grip of white supremacy against the quiet but determined push of black resistance. It is a reminder that progress in one part of the nation was often shadowed by regression in another. Beneath the gilded surface of prosperity and innovation, the South revealed a darker truth: that democracy, fragile and contested, could move backward as well as forward. The West's final wars and the breaking of native lands. While factories roared in the east and cities reached skyward, the West in the Gilded Age became the stage for another story, one of war, dispossession, and survival. For native peoples, this period was not gilded, but scarred. The final military clashes between tribes and the US Army, followed by sweeping federal policies, sought to transform native nations into fragments of what they once were. Yet even under overwhelming odds, resistance and adaptation endured, leaving a legacy of resilience alongside a trail of loss. The 1870s and 1880s saw the last great wars between native nations and the United States. Names like the Battle of the Little Bighorn, 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse stunned the nation by defeating George Armstrong Custer, became etched in memory. But victories were fleeting. By the mid-1880s, the relentless advance of US troops, settlers, and railroads ensured that most armed resistance was crushed. The Nez Perce, under Chief Joseph, fought a desperate retreat of more than 1,000 miles before surrendering in 1877. His words echoing through history: "I will fight no more forever." The Apache Wars under Geronimo dragged on until 1886, ending with his capture and exile. Each campaign narrowed the space for native autonomy, each surrender marking another boundary closed. Once the guns grew quieter, new weapons emerged: laws, schools, and missions. The Dawes Act of 1887 embodied this shift. Presented as a civilizing measure, it divided communal tribal lands into individual allotments, with the promise of private ownership and farming. To policymakers, this was assimilation. To native communities, it was dismemberment. Lands not allotted were declared surplus and sold to white settlers. Within decades, native landholdings shrank catastrophically, from 138 million acres in 1887 to barely 48 million by 1934. The Dawes Act was less about opportunity and more about erasure, slicing away the collective identity of tribes. Assimilation extended beyond land. Boarding schools like the infamous Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania sought to kill the Indian and save the man. Children were taken, sometimes forcibly, from their families, their hair cut, their languages banned, their traditions mocked. Uniforms replaced traditional clothing, English replaced native tongues, and Christianity replaced spiritual traditions. For many children, the experience was traumatic, leaving scars of cultural loss and disconnection. Yet even within these schools, students found ways to preserve fragments of identity, whispering songs in dormitories or carving symbols hidden from teachers' eyes. Missionaries and reformers painted their efforts as benevolent, but they carried the weight of cultural conquest. Native religions were suppressed, dances outlawed, ceremonies banned. Still, resistance continued, not always in open battle, but in quieter defiance. Families told stories in secret, Elders passed down languages against orders, and communities adapted traditions to survive in altered forms. The ghost dance movement of the late 1880s symbolized both desperation and hope. Preached by the Paiute prophet Wovoka, it promised that through ritual dance and faith, the old world of native sovereignty would be restored, the buffalo would return, and white domination would vanish. The movement spread rapidly across tribes, unnerving federal authorities. Fear turned to violence at Wounded Knee in 1890, where US troops killed more than 200 Lakota men, women, and children. For many, it was the symbolic end of the Indian Wars, a massacre that epitomized the tragic collision of cultures. And yet, native survival did not end in defeat. Communities reimagined their futures under impossible constraints. They built political organizations, adapted agriculture, and continued to resist cultural extinction. Even in the shadow of Wounded Knee, native voices refused silence. Leaders, writers, and activists emerged, determined to fight for sovereignty, identity, and rights. What if the United States had honored treaties, had respected native sovereignty, had allowed cultures to coexist rather than insisting on erasure? Would the West have developed differently, its landscapes shared rather than divided? Would cultural richness have flourished in ways lost to assimilation? Or was the hunger for land and expansion too deeply woven into the nation's fabric to permit such alternatives? The West's final wars and the breaking of native lands reveal another side of the Gilded Age, one stripped of shine, exposing the brutal mechanics of expansion. It was a time when the promise of America for settlers came at the cost of dispossession for native peoples. Yet it was also a time when resistance, however battered, endured, carrying forward languages, traditions, and identities into the future. The story is one of loss, but also of survival, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, the human will to endure does not vanish. Farmers' revolt and the language of populism. Out on the prairies and in the cotton fields, far from the bustling cities of steel and finance, another drama unfolded during the Gilded Age. Farmers, who once imagined themselves as the backbone of the Republic, now felt like its most neglected citizens. They were caught in a tightening vice, falling crop prices, rising debt, exploitative credit systems, and railroad monopolies that charged them dearly to move their harvests. For many, the promises of American democracy rang hollow. Their response was extraordinary. A revolt of ordinary people who demanded that the political and economic order be remade. The first stirrings came with the Grange, formerly known as the Patrons of Husbandry, founded in 1867. Originally intended as a social and educational group, it quickly became political as farmers realized their shared grievances. Grange halls dotted the countryside, serving as places to meet, debate, and strategize. Farmers pooled resources through cooperatives, attempting to bypass middlemen who profited from their labor. They lobbied for Granger laws to regulate railroad rates, and in some states, they achieved victories that hinted at the potential of collective action. By the 1880s, the farmers' alliances, one in the South, another in the Plains, took up the mantle. They organized massive gatherings where fiery orators denounced bankers and railroads as enemies of the common man. Their language was vivid, often moral. The farmer as producer, noble and honest, pitted against corrupt elites who drained his livelihood. The alliances promoted cooperative stores, pushed for government warehouses to stabilize crop prices, and demanded reforms to break the stranglehold of monopolies. Out of this ferment emerged the People's Party, better known as the Populists. In 1892, they held a national convention in Omaha and unveiled a platform that thundered with ambition. They called for the free coinage of silver to expand the money supply, government ownership of railroads and telegraph lines, a graduated income tax, and direct election of senators. measures that would later shape the progressive era. Their rhetoric drew on religious imagery, casting their struggle as almost biblical, a battle of good, honest producers against parasitic elites. Yet the movement was never free of contradictions. Race was the most glaring fault line. In the South, some populist leaders sought alliances between poor white and black farmers, recognizing that both were victims of the same exploitative systems. For a brief moment, there was the possibility of a biracial coalition that might have reshaped Southern politics. But white supremacy, entrenched and violent, tore these alliances apart. Many white populists retreated into segregationist language, undermining the very unity they preached. The dream of a truly inclusive populism remained unrealized. Regional tensions also weakened the movement. Western farmers facing droughts and long distances to markets did not always see eye to eye with Southern farmers dealing with cotton prices and sharecropping. And while the populists railed against Wall Street, urban laborers did not always join their cause. Workers and farmers shared grievances, but often distrusted each other's priorities. The result was a movement broad in aspiration, but fractured in practice. The Populist Party reached its peak in the 1892 election, when its candidate James B. Weaver won more than 1 million votes and carried 4 states. But by 1896, the party faced a dilemma. Should it maintain its independent platform, or fuse with the Democratic Party, which under William Jennings, Bryan championed free silver? Many chose fusion, seeing Bryan as their best chance to advance reforms. When Bryan lost to William McKinley, the populist movement fractured. By the turn of the century, much of its agenda seemed defeated. And yet the language of populism endured. The direct election of senators became law with the 17th Amendment. The graduated income tax was adopted. The suspicion of concentrated wealth and corporate power remained a powerful current in American politics. Populism left behind not just policies, but a vocabulary. Phrases like "the people versus the elites" that still echo in political debates today. What if the populists had managed to sustain a true biracial coalition in the South? What if farmers and industrial workers had found common cause? Could the Populist Party have reshaped American politics into a permanent third force, challenging the two-party system? Or were the divisions of race, region, and class too deeply entrenched to overcome? These questions linger, testifying to both the promise and the tragedy of the farmers' revolt. The revolt of the farmers was never just about wheat, cotton, or corn. It was about dignity, fairness, and the belief that democracy should serve the many rather than the few. In their speeches, in their platforms, and in their marches, populists gave voice to a frustration that had long simmered in the countryside. They failed to seize power, but they succeeded in leaving behind a political language, a language of resistance and possibility, that continues to shape American life. Women enter public life. The Gilded Age is often remembered as a man's world of railroads, steel mills, banks, and booming cities. Yet beneath the clang of machinery and the smoke of industry, another revolution unfolded, one quieter, more gradual, but no less transformative. Women, long confined to domestic spaces, began entering public life in unprecedented ways. They worked in factories and offices, taught in classrooms, and organized in churches and community halls. And in doing so, they reshaped not only their own roles, but also the political and moral landscape of the nation. The textile mills were among the first major employers of women. In places like Lowell, Massachusetts, young women labored at looms from dawn to dusk, their wages meager, but their independence hard-won. In the cities, clerical work expanded as typewriters and telephones transformed business. Secretaries, stenographers, and telephone operators, once unthinkable jobs for women, became common. Teaching, too, grew into a female-dominated profession, with thousands of women staffing classrooms across the expanding public school systems. These jobs did not erase gender hierarchies. Men still held supervisory roles and higher salaries, but they opened doors to a new kind of participation in public life. Alongside wage work came activism. Women who had long been active in church societies and charitable groups broadened their scope. The temperance movement, led by organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, framed alcohol not just as a moral problem, but as a social one, linking it to domestic violence, poverty, and public disorder. Campaigns against alcohol became campaigns for safer families, healthier communities, and eventually broader reforms. Settlement houses became another frontier of women's activism. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr's Hull House in Chicago, founded in 1889, provided education, childcare, legal aid, and public health initiatives for immigrant families. Hull House was more than charity. It was a social laboratory. Middle-class women lived alongside the poor, learning from them and experimenting with reforms. Classes in English and citizenship prepared immigrants for civic life, while legal clinics defended tenants against exploitative landlords. Hull House became a model, replicated across the country, where women's work blurred the line between private compassion and public politics. These experiences forged a new language of activism. Women began linking their roles as mothers and caretakers to public responsibilities. If they were responsible for the moral upbringing of children, why should they not also have a voice in shaping the laws that govern schools, public health, or labor standards? This municipal housekeeping argument gave women a way to justify political involvement without abandoning traditional ideals of femininity. It was a bridge between the private and public spheres, one that helped legitimize women's entry into civic debates. The suffrage movement drew strength from these broader activities. Groups like the National American Woman Suffrage Association argued that women deserved the vote not just as a right, but as a necessity for reforming society. Activists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton continued their decades-long struggle, while younger leaders emerged from the settlement houses and labor movements. For every woman marching or lobbying for suffrage, countless others contributed by organizing local clubs, running charity drives, or pushing for reforms in schools and neighborhoods. Together, they built a foundation of civic engagement that made the demand for political rights harder to ignore. Women's growing presence in public life also reshaped family dynamics. Daughters who earned wages contributed to household budgets, altering the balance of authority between parents and children. Married women who volunteered in reform movements gained a sense of independence beyond the home. Some men resisted these changes, fearing a loss of control, while others supported their wives and daughters as partners in a new vision of citizenship. The negotiation of gender roles was constant, sometimes tense, but undeniably transformative. What if women had been granted the vote earlier in the Gilded Age? Would urban reforms, sanitation, housing, labor laws have advanced more swiftly? Would the violence of strikes or the corruption of political machines have been tempered by a broader electorate? Or would entrenched power simply have found new ways to dismiss women's voices? The questions highlight how incomplete democracy was in this era and how much potential remained untapped. By the dawn of the 20th century, women had entered public life not as guests, but as participants. They worked, taught, organized, and lobbied. They built institutions like Hull House that stood as monuments to compassion and innovation. They connected the intimate concerns of family to the sweeping issues of politics. In the Gilded Age, women were not yet full citizens, but they were becoming something new, a political force in waiting, reshaping the boundaries of public life, one schoolroom, one settlement house, one speech at a time. Ideas that shaped the era: Darwin, Gospels, and society. The Gilded Age was not only a time of iron, steam, and skyscrapers, it was also an age of ideas. Intellectual battles raged in lecture halls, pulpits, newspapers, and parlor rooms, shaping how Americans interpreted the dizzying transformations around them. Economic inequality, mass immigration, urban poverty, and industrial might demanded new explanations. Some turned to science, others to scripture, others still to philosophy. The result was a culture alive with competing visions of how society should be ordered and where morality fit into a rapidly changing world. One of the most influential and controversial currents was social Darwinism. Borrowing from Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, thinkers like Herbert Spencer argued that competition weeded out the weak and rewarded the strong. In this view, millionaires were not exploiters but the fittest, proof that they deserved their fortunes. Poverty, meanwhile, was not injustice but evidence of personal failure. Social Darwinism provided a convenient justification for inequality. It reassured elites that their wealth was not only earned but natural, while telling the poor that their suffering was part of the order of things. The metaphor of survival of the fittest spread far beyond biology, becoming a social philosophy that hardened attitudes toward labor strikes, urban slums, and immigration. But not all accepted this cold calculus. In churches across the nation, the social gospel movement gained momentum. Protestant ministers like Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden argued that Christianity was not only about individual salvation, but about transforming society. The gospel, they said, demanded action against poverty, injustice, and exploitation. Sermons spoke of the kingdom of God not as a distant heaven, but as something to be built on earth, through settlement houses, labor rights, and urban reforms. For those who embraced the social gospel, charity was not enough. Systemic change was a moral duty. The clash between social Darwinism and the social gospel reflected deeper tensions. Was poverty the fault of the poor or of society? Was wealth a divine reward or a social responsibility? These questions were not abstract. They shaped how people voted, how they gave money, how they treated their neighbors. Into this intellectual ferment stepped Andrew Carnegie with his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth, 1889. Carnegie, a titan of steel, acknowledged the immense inequalities of the age, but argued that the rich had a duty to use their fortunes for the public good. He disdained charity that merely kept the poor afloat. Instead, he championed philanthropy that empowered, like libraries, universities, and cultural institutions. His own gifts funded thousands of public libraries across the United States, opening doors to self-improvement for millions. In Carnegie's vision, wealth was both reward and responsibility. The few should steward their riches wisely for the benefit of all. Ideas of merit and morality filtered into law and reform. Belief in individual responsibility, sharpened by social Darwinism, made many Americans suspicious of government welfare, encouraging only limited aid for the destitute. At the same time, social gospel advocates pushed for child labor laws, better housing, and improved working conditions. Out of these battles emerged the intellectual foundation of the Progressive era, when reformers sought to balance private enterprise with public responsibility. These competing visions also revealed the ways ideas travel through society. A factory owner influenced by social Darwinism might slash wages, convinced that competition demanded it. A minister shaped by the social gospel might organize parishioners to open a soup kitchen or campaign for labor reform. A wealthy industrialist inspired by Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth might endow a library that gave a poor child her first taste of Shakespeare or science. Ideas were not just words on paper. They were seeds that grew into bricks, laws, institutions, and habits of thought. What if social Darwinism had never taken root? Would America have embraced reform earlier, cushioning the blows of industrial capitalism? Or what if the social gospel had spread even further, turning charity into political revolution? Would the United States have developed a stronger welfare state decades before the New Deal? And what of Carnegie's philanthropy? Did it ease the sting of inequality? Or did it simply legitimize fortunes built on harsh labor practices? The Gilded Age was gilded not only with gold, but with words, arguments, and visions of society. Social Darwinism, the social gospel, and the gospel of wealth were not just intellectual exercises, they were maps of morality in a turbulent time. Together, they revealed a nation struggling to define what wealth, poverty, and justice meant in an age of both extraordinary progress and extraordinary inequality. Inventions, power, and networks. The Gilded Age was as much a laboratory as it was a marketplace. The pace of invention quickened to a near-dizzying speed, reshaping how Americans worked, spoke, entertained themselves, and illuminated their homes. The telephone, typewriter, phonograph, and electric light were not simply gadgets. They were revolutions in miniature, each one binding people into new networks of communication and power. The great inventions of this era remind us that technology is never neutral. Behind every breakthrough were laboratories, investors, and legal battles that determined not only who profited, but also how society itself would be wired together. The telephone is perhaps the most vivid example. When Alexander Graham Bell patented it in 1876, few could imagine a world where voices traveled across wires. Within a generation, telephones spread through cities and offices, collapsing distance and transforming business. No longer did a clerk have to send a boy running across town with a message. Now, instructions, orders, and deals could be sealed in real time. But the telephone's spread was not automatic. It was nurtured by investment, standards, and monopoly control. Bell Telephone, later AT&T, used patents and legal strategies to consolidate dominance, creating a system where one network became indispensable. The telephone became both a marvel and a monopoly. The typewriter, too, carried transformative weight. It revolutionized office work, creating a new professional role, the typist. Often, young women filled these jobs, their nimble fingers setting the rhythm of business communication. The machine gave businesses a more formal, standardized, and efficient means of record-keeping. It also symbolized a shift. The office as a space of mechanized productivity, not just human calculation. The clatter of keys was the soundtrack of a new kind of workplace. Thomas Edison's phonograph captured another frontier: sound itself. For the first time, music and speech could be recorded, stored, and replayed. Families could gather around a cylinder and hear voices long gone, or enjoy a band without a single musician in the room. The phonograph hinted at a new economy of entertainment, one where culture became a commodity that could be mass-produced and distributed. But the invention that truly redefined the age was electricity. The incandescent light bulb, perfected by Edison in the late 1870s, promised to extend the day, liberating people from the limits of gaslight and candle. Factories could run longer shifts, offices could operate after dark, and city streets could glow with safety. Yet electricity was not merely a matter of bulbs and wires. It was an infrastructure project of colossal scale. The question was not only how to produce light, but how to distribute power. This led to one of the most famous technological battles of the era, the War of Currents. Edison championed direct current, DC, a system that worked well for short distances, but struggled to travel far without losing power. Nikola Tesla, working with George Westinghouse, promoted alternating current, AC, which could be transmitted over vast networks using transformers. The rivalry was not purely technical, it was political, economic, and cultural. Edison launched public campaigns warning that AC was dangerous, even staging electrocutions of animals to prove his point. Westinghouse countered with demonstrations of AC's efficiency and range. The struggle culminated in dramatic moments like the electrification of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, powered by AC, a symbolic victory that foreshadowed AC's eventual dominance. The AC/DC battle shows how innovation was never just about science. It was about persuasion, marketing, public perception, and the ability to secure contracts with cities and industries. Once a city committed to one system, it was effectively locked in for decades. Infrastructure was destiny. A choice of wires and voltage in the 1880s could shape an urban landscape well into the 20th century. The ecology of invention thrived on more than just bright ideas. Laboratories became organized centers of research where teams, not lone geniuses, tested materials, refined prototypes, and sought new applications. Patent offices overflowed with filings, serving as battlegrounds where ideas were defended and monetized. Investors scoured exhibitions for the next breakthrough, turning inventors into celebrities or bankrupting them when backing faltered. The result was a culture of innovation that rewarded not only creativity, but also persistence, networking, and legal acumen. What if Edison had prevailed and direct current had remained the standard? Would cities have been denser, their electric grids limited to small radiuses? Would rural electrification have been delayed by decades? Conversely, what if the phonograph had never caught on? Would radio and later cinema have developed differently, filling the cultural gap? The what-ifs remind us that every invention opens some doors and closes others, steering society down paths that feel inevitable only in hindsight. By the end of the Gilded Age, America was no longer simply a land of farms, factories, and railroads. It was a land of networks. Telephone lines crisscrossed neighborhoods, electric wires dangled above streets, typewriters clattered in offices, and recorded music whispered from phonographs. Innovation had become part of daily life, binding millions into invisible systems of power and communication. It was a reminder that progress was not only built in steel and stone, but also in copper wire and fragile glass bulbs, shaping the rhythms of modern life. The consumer's age. If the railroads stitched the nation together and the factories filled its veins with steel and coal, then consumer goods gave the Gilded Age its beating heart. For the first time, millions of Americans began to experience what we might call modern life through the marketplace. Ready-made clothes in standardized sizes, canned foods on kitchen shelves, factory-produced furniture, and brand-name products advertised in magazines and newspapers. Consumption was no longer just about survival. It was about identity, aspiration, and belonging. The department store became the cathedral of this new consumer world. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, vast emporiums such as Macy's, Marshall Field's, and Wanamaker's dazzled customers with glass display cases, electric lights, and a seemingly endless variety of goods. A shopper could wander through sections devoted to gloves, hats, perfumes, toys, and even furniture, all under one roof. Clerks were trained to treat women customers with respect, creating a new public space where middle-class women could move freely. For many, entering a department store felt like stepping into a palace of abundance, a democratization of luxury that made even ordinary customers feel like royalty for an afternoon. For those who lived far from the glittering cities, the mail-order catalog opened the same world of goods. Sears, Roebuck and Company, and Montgomery Ward mailed thick books filled with everything from boots to bicycles, stoves to musical instruments. On isolated farms, the arrival of a catalog was like receiving a window to another universe. With a few stamps and an order slip, a family could participate in national consumer culture, collapsing the distance between rural homesteads and urban markets. The catalog not only sold goods, it sold the idea that every American, no matter how remote, could be part of the same modern experience. Advertising fueled these new habits. Posters, newspapers, and magazines filled with catchy slogans and bold images. Brands emerged as household names. Ivory soap promised purity, Coca-Cola promised refreshment, Kodak promised to capture memories. The language of advertising shifted from describing a product's utility to creating desire, identity, and lifestyle. A bar of soap was no longer just soap. It was cleanliness, respectability, even happiness. In this way, advertising laid the foundation for the consumer psychology that would define the 20th century. Mass production made this all possible. Standardized clothing sizes replaced the need for every garment to be custom sewn. Canned foods freed families from dependence on seasonal crops, putting peaches on the table in January and beef stew in minutes instead of hours. Furniture factories churned out chairs and tables that, while not heirloom quality, could fill homes at affordable prices. The scale of production lowered costs, putting once luxury goods within reach of the growing middle class. But this accessibility came with a price. Families now found themselves tied to economic cycles, buying on installment plans or credit that bound their fortunes to the ups and downs of industry and finance. Consumption extended beyond goods to leisure. Amusement parks like Coney Island offered thrills to working-class families with roller coasters, bright lights, and cheap tickets. Vaudeville theaters showcased comedy, music, and variety acts, providing affordable entertainment for diverse audiences. Sports, too, became mass spectacles. Baseball emerged as the national pastime, while boxing matches and college football games drew enormous crowds. The city became not just a place of work, but a kaleidoscope of options for pleasure and escape. The consumer's age reshaped daily rhythms. Shopping trips became outings, catalog browsing became evening entertainment, and advertising slogans seeped into ordinary conversation. The home itself changed. Kitchens filled with canned goods and new appliances, living rooms with phonographs and affordable furniture. What it meant to live modern was increasingly defined not only by where one lived or worked, but by what one owned and consumed. What if this consumer revolution had not occurred? Would cities have been defined only by factories and sweatshops, their citizens exhausted with no space for leisure or aspiration? Would rural isolation have remained unbroken, families cut off from the rhythms of national life? Or did consumption, with all its promises and pitfalls, give ordinary Americans a sense of participation in progress, even as inequality deepened? By the end of the Gilded Age, the United States was not only a producer's economy, but a consumer's society. Goods and entertainments knit together a nation as effectively as railroads and telegraphs. The glitter of department stores, the pages of catalogs, the hum of amusement parks, and the cheers at baseball games all testified to a new cultural fact. To be American increasingly meant to buy, to watch, to enjoy. Consumption was no longer peripheral to life. It was life itself, reshaping identities and aspirations in ways that would echo into the next century. Realism and naturalism. Literature confronts the city. The Gilded Age was not only about steel, railroads, and fortunes, it was also about words. As cities grew and factories belched smoke into the sky, American writers turned their gaze to the rawness of urban life, the tensions of ambition, and the struggles of ordinary people. Gone were the romantic landscapes and heroic tales that had dominated earlier decades. In their place came realism and naturalism, literary movements determined to show life as it was, with all its grit, contradictions, and quiet tragedies. Mark Twain, ever the satirist, offered one of the sharpest mirrors. In The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, 1873, co-written with Charles Dudley Warner, Twain exposed corruption, speculation, and the emptiness beneath America's glittering surface. His characters were strivers, schemers, and dreamers whose ambitions often outpaced their morals. Twain's humor made the critique palatable, but the message was clear. Beneath the gold leaf lay decay. Later works like Adventures of Huckleberry Finn further captured the hypocrisies of race, class, and civilization itself, challenging readers to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they lived in. Stephen Crane took realism a step further into naturalism, where characters were not just flawed, but trapped by forces beyond their control. In Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, 1893, Crane portrayed the crushing poverty of New York's Bowery. Maggie, a young woman full of hope, is ground down by environment and circumstance until her life collapses. Crane's spare, unsentimental prose left readers with no illusions. The city could chew up and discard the vulnerable without mercy. Later, in The Red Badge of Courage, he applied the same style to war, portraying not glory, but fear, confusion, and human frailty. Henry James, in contrast, explored the subtler moral ambiguities of modern life. His novels often depicted Americans navigating between Old World Europe and New World ambition, torn between tradition and modernity. Works like The Portrait of a Lady examined questions of choice, independence, and social constraint, particularly for women. James's careful psychological portraits suggested that the real battles of the age were not always fought in factories or streets, but in hearts and minds wrestling with freedom and responsibility. Together, these writers built a literary landscape that mirrored the industrial one, complex, restless, and sometimes brutal. Realism insisted that literature should show life as it is, not as it ought to be. Its characters were clerks, workers, immigrants, and social climbers, not kings and knights. Its settings were crowded tenements, bustling offices, and polluted streets, not untouched wilderness. Naturalism pushed further, portraying human beings as products of heredity and environment, often powerless against poverty, vice, or social structures. For readers, these works were more than entertainment. They were tools for understanding. A factory worker might see his struggles reflected in Crane's stories. A middle-class reader might confront uncomfortable questions about morality and privilege through James. Twain's humor could prick the conscience of an audience that preferred to laugh rather than weep. Literature became a way for Americans to process the disorienting changes of the Gilded Age. The influence went beyond the page. Realist and naturalist literature helped shape public opinion, fueling debates about poverty, labor, and reform, just as muckraking journalists would later expose corruption and corporate abuse. These writers exposed the human cost of industrial progress. Their stories lent emotional depth to statistics, giving faces and names to the abstract forces of capitalism, inequality, and social change. What if American literature had clung to Romanticism instead, painting only idealized pictures of rural life and noble heroes? Would the pressing social problems of the city have been ignored longer, hidden beneath sentimental stories? Or did the starkness of realism, even when painful, help prepare Americans for the reforms of the progressive era? These what-ifs remind us that art does not simply reflect society. It nudges it, questions it, sometimes even pushes it forward. The aesthetic of the Gilded Age was born not of pastoral sunsets, but of factory smoke and electric light, of crowded streets and silent drawing rooms. Realism and naturalism captured the contradictions of ambition and decay, morality and survival. They offered no easy answers, but they forced readers to look closely at the world they inhabited. In doing so, they turned literature into a companion for a restless nation, one trying to make sense of itself amid the noise and glare of modernity. City planning, public health, and the beautiful city. If the Gilded Age was an era of booming skyscrapers and dazzling electric lights, it was also an age of filth. The rapid growth of cities strained every system designed to keep them livable. Streets filled with horse manure, alleys piled high with garbage, and rivers choked with sewage. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis swept through tenements, where entire families crowded into airless rooms. The glittering skyline was only half the story. Down below, disease and squalor threatened the very promise of urban progress. Out of this contradiction arose a new determination: to clean, to plan, and to make the city not only a machine for growth, but also a space for health and beauty. Municipal governments, long dominated by political machines that thrived on contracts and patronage, were forced to innovate. Engineers and sanitation workers emerged as new civic professionals, measuring the flow of water, the purity of air, and the density of housing. Cities invested in sewer systems, often marvels of underground engineering, designed to carry away waste that once ran openly through the streets. Public health boards tracked outbreaks and began to see disease as something society could prevent, not just endure. Garbage collection became a municipal duty, creating an army of workers whose unglamorous labor did more for urban survival than the grandest skyscraper. The push for hygiene reshaped professions as well. Doctors and reformers began to connect poverty with disease, linking social reform to health. Nurses, often trained through new settlement houses or religious organizations, brought care into neighborhoods where hospitals were absent or unwelcoming. Inspectors checked milk for contamination, fought adulterated foods, and promoted vaccination campaigns. The science of germs turned invisible enemies into targets for public action, changing the way city dwellers thought about cleanliness, morality, and responsibility. At the same time, another current emerged, the idea that beauty itself could be a force for civic improvement. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 offered a vision of what a city might be. Known as the White City, its gleaming neoclassical buildings, orderly boulevards, and expansive lagoons seemed to embody harmony and grandeur. Millions of visitors walked through its avenues, dazzled by the contrast to the grimy streets back home. The fair inspired what became known as the City Beautiful movement, which argued that monumental architecture, broad parks, and carefully planned vistas could uplift citizens, foster civic pride, and discourage disorder. Urban reformers seized on the idea. Washington, D.C. received new plans for classical buildings and sweeping avenues. In Cleveland, Daniel Burnham designed parks and civic centers to elevate the city's image. Even smaller towns aspired to boulevards and fountains, believing that beauty could create order. Parks designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, like Central Park in New York and the Emerald Necklace in Boston, offered not just green relief but also carefully managed spaces where diverse social classes could mingle under the watchful eye of order and design. Yet the politics of beauty and health were never neutral. Poor neighborhoods were often treated not as communities but as problems to be solved. Tenements were condemned and cleared, sometimes displacing families with little regard for where they would go. Reformers spoke of slums as if they were diseases themselves, erasing the human lives within them. City planning sometimes blurred the line between compassion and control, aiming as much to discipline the poor as to help them. What if the City Beautiful had gone further, pairing monumental buildings with affordable housing, sanitation, and social services? Could cities have become both healthier and more equitable? Or was beauty a distraction, a gilded mask that hid the persistent inequalities of urban life? The what-ifs remind us that aesthetics and hygiene were entwined with politics. Choices about whose health mattered, whose neighborhoods were preserved, and whose were erased. By the turn of the century, American cities had been permanently altered. They were no longer accidental collections of factories, houses, and shops. They were spaces consciously engineered, measured, and adorned. Engineers laid pipes and wires beneath the ground, while architects and planners drew grand visions above it. Reformers linked cleanliness to morality, beauty to civic virtue. The Gilded Age city became both laboratory and stage, a place where disease was fought with sewers, where pride was built in marble and granite, and where the poor themselves were too often reduced to planning problems. Empire at the turn of the century. By the final decade of the 19th century, the United States stood at a crossroads. For decades, the nation had looked inward. Westward expansion, industrial growth, immigration and urbanization had consumed its energy. But by 1898, a shift occurred. America looked outward. The Spanish-American War, the annexation of overseas territories, and the fierce debates that followed marked the nation's entry onto the global stage. The Gilded Age, so often thought of as a story of domestic industry and inequality, ended with the United States grappling with questions of empire, citizenship, and identity. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was brief but transformative. Sparked by Cuban struggles for independence and inflamed by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, the war captured the American imagination. Yellow journalism, with its sensational headlines and lurid illustrations, pushed the public toward intervention. In a matter of months, US forces crushed Spain's weakened empire, defeating its fleets in Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba. The war's brevity masked its significance. In defeating Spain, the United States inherited not only Cuba, but also Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The victory fed a growing appetite for expansion. Advocates of empire argued that new territories offered markets for surplus goods, coaling stations for a growing navy, and prestige in the international order. Industrialists and politicians alike looked to Asia as a frontier for American commerce, with the Philippines seen as a gateway to China's vast market. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan's writings on sea power resonated deeply, persuading leaders that a strong navy and overseas bases were essential for national greatness. For expansionists, empire was not betrayal, but destiny, an extension of manifest destiny now projected across oceans. But beneath these arguments lay deeper currents. Racial ideologies, sharpened by social Darwinism, framed empire as a civilizing mission. Non-white peoples were often depicted as wards needing guidance, incapable of self-rule without American oversight. Such language cloaked conquest in the rhetoric of benevolence, even as it imposed domination. In the Philippines, resistance fighters under Emilio Aguinaldo quickly discovered that American liberation from Spain meant a new colonial master. The brutal Philippine-American War, with atrocities on both sides, revealed the violence behind the rhetoric of uplift. At home, the annexation of territories forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions. What did citizenship mean? Would Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, and Guamanians be considered full Americans? Could a republic founded on principles of self-government justify ruling subjects without consent? Anti-imperialists, a coalition of figures ranging from Mark Twain to former President Grover Cleveland, warned that empire abroad meant hypocrisy at home. They argued that exporting injustice, denying liberty to others while preaching democracy, would corrode the nation's moral core. The debates were fierce and unresolved. Some feared that empire would drag the United States into endless foreign entanglements, undermining its republican character. Others believed expansion was history's calling, that America was destined to become a global power. The Senate debates over the Treaty of Paris in 1899, which officially ended the war and ratified territorial acquisitions, were some of the most contentious in the nation's history. Ultimately, expansionist arguments prevailed, but not without leaving deep divisions. The new empire created practical dilemmas as well. Governing distant islands required legal improvisation. The insular cases decided by the Supreme Court in the early 1900s declared that the Constitution did not fully extend to unincorporated territories. In effect, inhabitants of Puerto Rico and the Philippines were denied full rights, caught in a gray zone between subjects and citizens. This doctrine allowed the United States to enjoy the benefits of empire without fully embracing its responsibilities, institutionalizing inequality on a global scale. What if the United States had chosen differently in 1898? What if Cuba had been left to chart its own course without American oversight? Or if the Philippines had gained independence after Spain's defeat? Would America have developed as a continental power with strong democratic ideals rather than a global empire marked by contradictions? Or was expansion too tempting, too bound up with markets, military prestige, and the belief in destiny to resist? By the turn of the century, the United States was no longer just a nation of farms, factories, and railroads. It was an empire, with holdings in the Caribbean and Pacific, a powerful navy, and ambitions that stretched far beyond its shores. But it was also a nation wrestling with its conscience, torn between ideals of liberty and the temptations of power. The Gilded Age ended not just in smoke and steel, but in gunfire across oceans, leaving America with both new opportunities and new moral dilemmas, questions that would haunt the 20th century. Transition to the Progressive Era. By the dawn of the 20th century, the contradictions of the Gilded Age had become impossible to ignore. Giant corporations stretched their influence across industries, wielding power greater than many state governments. Political machines entrenched in urban centers remained both a source of patronage and a target of reform. Cities gleamed with department stores and electric lights, while tenements festered with poverty and disease. Farmers, laborers, immigrants, and reformers had all raised their voices in protest, but the institutions of wealth and politics seemed immovable. Yet beneath the surface, another current gathered strength. A middle class increasingly convinced that reform was not only possible, but essential. The assassination of President William McKinley in 1901 symbolized the fragility of order at the turn of the century. His death elevated Theodore Roosevelt, a figure whose energy and vision embodied the changing mood of the nation. Roosevelt represented a new kind of leadership, part reformer, part nationalist, part moral crusader. His presidency marked the moment when the unfinished business of the Gilded Age began to take shape as the Progressive Era, a movement that sought to tame the excesses of capitalism without dismantling its foundations. Corporations had been the giants of the Gilded Age. Carnegie Steel, Standard Oil, and countless railroads had demonstrated the extraordinary potential of concentrated capital. But they had also provoked resentment. Unfair pricing, dangerous working conditions, and monopolistic practices had created a sense that the system served only the few. Roosevelt's embrace of antitrust action, famously branding himself a trust buster, signaled a shift. Where the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had been weakly enforced, Roosevelt gave it teeth. For the first time, Americans saw a president confront corporate power directly, setting the tone for decades of regulatory politics. Reform extended beyond the boardrooms. The progressive impulse sought to protect consumers whose kitchens were increasingly filled with canned food and factory-produced goods. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, 1906, though published a few years later, epitomized the movement's concern. Unsafe meatpacking plants, filthy working conditions, and the hidden dangers of industrial food. Calls for transparency and accountability pushed the government toward laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. The very systems of mass production and consumption pioneered in the Gilded Age now demanded safeguards to ensure they did not poison the very public they claimed to serve. Conservation was another arena where Roosevelt left a mark. The Gilded Age had witnessed unrestrained exploitation of natural resources, timber cut without replanting, rivers polluted, landscapes stripped for coal and ore. Roosevelt, influenced by conservationists like Gifford Pinchot and naturalists like John Muir, insisted that the nation's natural wealth was not infinite. He expanded national parks and forests, framing conservation as both patriotic duty and long-term strategy. The balance between preservation and use became a defining debate, one that continues today. The transition from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era was not a clean break. Machines like Tammany Hall still thrived, corporations still dominated markets. Racism and segregation deepened in the South, where Jim Crow laws calcified the Counterrevolution begun after Reconstruction. But patterns established in the late 19th century created the very conditions that progressives sought to address. The inequality of wealth, the rise of consumer culture, the spread of urban problems, and the persistence of political corruption all demanded responses. Reformers were less radicals than managers. They wanted to rationalize, regulate, and discipline the forces unleashed by decades of rapid growth. What if McKinley had lived and Roosevelt had not ascended to the presidency? Would the progressive era have unfolded more slowly or taken a different shape under less energetic leadership? Could the Gilded Age's contradictions have deepened unchecked, delaying reform until crisis forced more radical solutions? These questions remind us how much history depends on the interplay of structure and chance, on vast economic forces, but also on the individuals who happen to hold power at crucial moments. The Gilded Age left behind an America transformed, a nation of sprawling railroads, towering corporations, urban spectacles, and bitter inequalities. It also left behind a set of questions about democracy, fairness, wealth, and responsibility that no skyscraper or political machine could silence. The progressive era did not erase the Gilded Age, it grew from it, inheriting its triumphs and its failures, its inventions and its injustices. The gilded surface had cracked, and beneath it, Americans now confronted the raw materials of modern life, demanding to be shaped into something more just, more humane, and more enduring.